like just to
I'm sure. He likes brave likes that. I'm sure.
Hab doch gar nicht herumgeschaut. Du brauchst ja grüne Papier. Ja, diese NPC braucht eine größere Frau. Weißt du warum? Das ist eine ganze Klasse da aus Pisa. Schulklasse. Okay. Ja.
Okay, shall we make good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's seminar. Thank you, so many people, for attending. Probably MPC needs to move to bigger premises for the popularity of our seminars, or maybe it's the popularity of the speaker. So I'm very happy to welcome Rainer Bauböck, who needs no introduction here at EUI, many years Professor of Social Theory in the Department of Political and Social Science, and also we're very happy this is a seminar with the Global SIT project, which I think is one of Rainer's most enduring contributions here to EUI, an invaluable resource on global citizenship, which will continue to develop in years to come, and which Rainer is still engaged as a part-time professor here. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Rainer. We are also live streaming this, so welcome to the millions of people joining us all over the world for this seminar. It feels like there's millions of people also in the room. Rainer will speak for around 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussions. So I will hand immediately over to Rainer. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. It feels good, of course, to be back at the EUI and to have such a crowd. It also means that MPC needs a larger room,
Bigger building, yeah.
Especially if we start to seriously collaborate with between Global City and MPC. No, thanks for coming. So this is a paper that is still forthcoming, and that where I engage with my colleagues and friends who are mostly political theorists and have been involved in the debate on the ethics of migration, as it's known, that has asked one basic, simple question. Is it justified or legitimate for democratic states to have any form of immigration control at all? Or are there justice-based reasons why democratic states would need to keep their borders open? And I've always felt that there's something wrong with the premises of the debate. And one of the things that I think is problematic is that they are so strongly focused on the question of justice, and they pay little attention, or in the wrong way, attention to questions of democracy. So I want to correct this by talking about whether or not there are democratic reasons for either closing borders or keeping borders fairly open. And then I will try to apply this a little bit, but not too much, to the specific context of Europe and the European Union. So that's the plan. And on this slide here, I only have 2 slides for you. On this slide here, this is the summary of my argument. So let me preface this by explaining how most political theorists see this problem. On the side of those who argue in favor of open borders, there are 2 justice-based arguments. One is the argument that we live in a globally unjust world. Resources and opportunities are extremely unequally distributed across states in the world. My good friend and the lead theorist in the field, Joseph Kerens, call this a feudal situation. So citizenship in the world, he says, is like feudal status in medieval times. You acquire it by birth, and it provides you with a set of opportunities that you cannot change, because the rich states and the democratic states are entitled to keep out people from poor states and less democratic states because they were born with the wrong citizenship. There is also the argument by Robert Goodin that was made even a little bit earlier that says if we really care about global distributive justice, we have only two options. One is to move the money to where the poor people live And if we are not ready to do this, the only other option we have is to let the poor people come to where the money is. That means open our borders for immigration from the global south. That's one argument. The other argument is not based, hello Bridget, is less based on global social justice and more on freedom and the right of states to control and constrain freedom or not to do so. And here the argument was again made by Joseph Cairns that we consider it to be part of the freedom that democratic states have to protect, that people are free to move around inside the territory of states. So freedom of internal movement within the state territory is considered to be a human right today. Right? Why is that the case? Because people have interests in being free to move. That may have to do with their need to look for opportunities to find a job, to find a partner for life, or even just to visit other places they find interesting. And if these are the interests that make it imperative for liberal states to protect internal freedom of movement, why don't the same interests apply to international freedom of movement? It's exactly the same interest that people have when they want to cross borders. They want to look for jobs, they want to have families across borders, and improve their opportunities and lead their own life in a free way. So how come that liberal states dare to constrain international freedom of movement, whereas they accept they cannot do this inside their territories? This is what Joe calls the cantilever argument. You use internal freedom of movement as a cantilever to argue in favor of open borders in international movement. So these are the two arguments in favor of freedom of movement and open borders. Now, what's the argument, the counter-argument on the other side? This is about democracy. This is where democracy comes in. This is made by David Miller and Michael Walzer and some others who say that democracy is about self-determination of the people. Right? So, and controlling who enters the territory and who becomes a member of the polity is the essence of self-determination. So it cannot be true that democracies have to keep their borders open because they must be able to control their membership, and that entails again that they have to have a prior right to control who enters their territory, because those people who enter their territory eventually end up to also have a claim to membership. So the structure of the argument is two justice-based reasons for freedom of movement: global distributive justice and individual freedom and autonomy, versus a democratic argument for immigration control. Right? And now I want to turn this upside down a little bit by arguing that maybe there are also democratic arguments in favor of relatively open borders that make it less clear that we cannot overcome this dilemma. We have to choose either justice or democracy, which I find deeply unsatisfactory from an intellectual perspective. And maybe the arguments in favor of freedom of immigration are not strong enough to yield the conclusion that states have to unconditionally open their borders. So I want to close that gap. That's the project. So that's okay. When you do this kind of exercise, you also have to think a little bit about your approach in the field. So let me just mention that one issue that has plagued the political theory debate is a famous distinction that was introduced by John Rawls, the most famous political philosopher of the 20th century, where he distinguished between ideal theory and non-ideal theory. And basically what that means is we first have to think about what justice requires in an ideal world, where everybody is assumed to not just understand the requirements of justice, but also to be willing to do what justice requires. So full compliance, as he calls it. And that has to be distinguished from a real world in which we may figure out what justice requires, but we also know that many people are not willing to act accordingly. So the world is non-ideal because there is not compliance. You cannot assume that everybody does what is just and required. And in the Rawlsian world, these are two levels of theory. You have to do one or the other. You start with ideal theory and then you go to non-ideal theory, but it's not clear that you can ever bridge that gap either. And I always found this also unsatisfactory because you, as a political theorist who wants to talk to a democratic audience, you have to talk about conditions that exist now and how they could be changed and reformed and improved towards something that you might regard as more ideal than the present world. So I find myself more in line with a more recent current in political theory that call themselves normative political realists. That does not mean realism in the sense that we accept the world as it is, let alone realism as in international relations where we assume that states just pursue their self-interest at all costs. It means starting from real-world conditions and thinking about pathways towards a better future and criticizing the current world from that perspective, rather than just from the perspective of an ideal world that is counterposed to the current world without saying how we are going to arrive there. So there are many versions of normative realism, but one that I like was spelled out by Adrian Little and Terry MacDonald, and I'll just give you the quote, what they think normative realism ought to be about. It's a problem-centered methodological strategy, problem also in the sense of real-world political problems, a focus on the political value of legitimacy, so not just on the value of justice, and a normative and critical commitment. So it's still normative in the sense that it has to be critical. It cannot be just affirmative or conservative in the sense of saying it's okay what we have, and we just try to explain what we have. The second methodological argument, prelude that I have to make is that I want to attack what I see as biases in the standard theory of migration and political theory, and there are two biases that I want to attack. One is a statist bias, and the other one is a sedentarist bias. What I mean by a statist bias is most theories are developed with the idea that there is one unit, one entity, which is a destination state of immigration, and we consider what claims people have who are outside that state and are not connected to that state to enter the state, right? And I find this unhelpful because I think you get a much clearer picture about what immigration is about if you think about how people are often already connected to their destination state before arriving, and especially if you think about how immigration states are related to emigration states. So if you think about migration as a relational thing that happens that involves necessarily not just one state but several states. Thirdly, it's also useful to think about the state as not being the only game in town, but other political entities such as the European Union or maybe also provinces and cities at the lower level and their forms of immigration control or absence of immigration control, because that explains to us why the type of control that is exercised by states may not be absolutely necessary for any type of political community. There may be other forms of polities that have different imperatives with regard to immigration compared to those of states. The sedentarist bias is the idea that the standard assumption is immigrants enter not just a territory, but a society that consists of native citizens. And native citizens are considered to be sedentary in the territory. They reside there permanently. Now, what's potentially wrong with this perspective is that immigrants enter societies that consist of populations that themselves may be to a significant degree mobile, and that eventually may also want to leave. So if you combine an immigration perspective with an emigration perspective, you also have to think about states as being generally, simultaneously, immigration states and emigration states. And the two perspectives need to be compatible with each other. So whatever an immigration state does, has effects on an emigration state, and therefore on itself also as a potential emigration state. In other words, the interests of citizens themselves in their own mobility must be factored into the equation that figures out what the rights of immigrants are to join a society. I hope this will become clearer as I explain it then with an example later on that I hope will illustrate what I want to say here. So let me briefly explain the first part of this argument that I see here on the slide. And this is, I want to deny the current orthodoxy, which is that democratic self-determination entails a right to control international immigration into the territory. And the way I do this is by introducing a distinction between concepts that are often considered to be perfect synonyms. This is something that political theorists quite often do. You use two concepts that look like they are exactly the same, and then you spell out that they actually mean different things. And these two concepts are self-determination and self-government. Right? Most people think, that's the same thing. And I want to claim they are not. If you look at how self-determination is used, especially in international law, it very often refers to things such as the integrity of the territory of the state, or alternatively, the right to break up a state territory. The claims of oppressed peoples to self-determination are directed against the current state and its territory. And secondly, self-determination also refers very often to the right of states to determine their own members, to their own nationality and citizenship laws. So self-determination at its core very often refers to the right of states to determine their own boundaries, both the boundaries of territory and the boundaries of membership. Now, the idea why self-determination is normatively attractive very often relies on an analogy with individual self-determination. Right? So the idea is, as individuals, we are autonomous, we are free, we determine ourselves, we have our own will, our plans for life, and if we come together in a democratic polity, then the collective that we form should have analogous rights of self-determination. Right? That's the idea why self-determination is attractive, because it relies on individual self-determination. Now, notice where the analogy breaks down. As an individual, I cannot self-determine my boundaries. The term individual already implies I'm indivisible, I'm an entity, a naturally given entity. If I think about what it means to determine myself as an individual, I think about how I can govern myself, right? What I can do about my life, how I can shape my life. But it would never occur to me to think that that means I should also be able to duplicate my body and enlarge it or shrink it or whatever, or to split my brain into two. That's not entailed. So the question why collective entities, such as states, should have a right of self-determination that entails the right to control what territory they have and who their members are, does not follow from the normative core of self-determination, which is individual autonomy. It's an extra, that states claim they have. And my claim is that extra does exist, but it is not derived from democracy. It's derived from something else. So let me first look at the arguments that it's the it's democracy that entails that states have a right to self-determination. That means they also have the right to control who comes into their territory and becomes a member. One argument is famously made by Michael Walzer, who says that democracies need self-determination because otherwise they couldn't be stable over time and they couldn't be what he calls communities of character. That means nations, basically. So let me give the quote. Admission and exclusion are at the core of communal independence. They suggest the deepest meaning of self-determination. Without them, there could not be communities of character, historically stable, ongoing associations of men and women with some special commitment to one another and some special sense of their common life. So what is he saying there? Democracy needs self-determination over immigration in order to preserve the continuity, the special character, the mutual commitments between its citizens. It's not an inherent feature of democracy, but it needs it instrumentally in order to preserve that. So there are other people who spell out that argument more directly. It's about preserving the nation. So states rely on nations, and in order to preserve nations and their homogeneity and their continuity, the state must control immigration into the nation. The second argument is not an instrumental one, but a kind of intrinsic argument. That here I give you another quote from a recent book by Sarah Song. It says, the right to control immigration derives from the right of the demos to rule itself. Deciding whom to admit into the territory and into political membership is a critical part of the task of defining who the collective is. Abrogating this right of the demos fails to take democratic self-determination seriously. Now, I want to debunk these two arguments very briefly. The first, the instrumental argument, I think, is incoherent. And it's incoherent because it singles out immigration as a source of change in society that states need to control, without considering that there are many other sources of change that liberal states cannot control or do not claim to control in the same way. And this argument was nicely spelled out by a Dutch-American political theorist whose name is Bas van der Vossen. And again, let me give you a quote. The nature of the group, meaning the group of citizens, is always changing. It changes because new people are born, because of outside cultural influences, and because of technological change. It also changes because of immigration. So you have these multiple sources of change. Now, would we say that states, liberal states, need to control fertility rates in order to make sure that there is sufficient continuity of the nation? Would we say that states have to control the import of cultural ideas from other countries that might change the cultural identity of the nation? So would we say that states have to control technology because it might change the makeup of the nation? So all of these are, in a way, open questions that at some point states actually might say, yes, we have to do this, but only at some point. Liberal states don't claim this is the core of their self-determination, that they have, that they can exercise control powers over all these sources of change. So why wouldn't the same apply to immigration? Why couldn't states say that maybe we have to control immigration when it really, really completely changes the makeup of the society, but why would they need immigration control powers over every single individual that enters the territory in order to achieve that goal? This doesn't seem to be obvious to me. So you might come to the conclusion that then, let me retrace my steps. Let me briefly look at the inherent feature argument. You know that it's the essence of self-determination that you can control immigration. That's a little bit harder to defeat because it's needed tautologically. You just build it into the definition of self-determination that states can control immigration. But you might still say what's wrong with this by looking at history and by other entities than the state. If you look at history, you find out very quickly that the obsession with controlling immigration is a fairly recent origin. It basically goes back to World War I. Before World War I, states didn't have the capacity and often didn't have the desire to control immigration. They were much more obsessed about controlling out-migration. You know, in the great transatlantic migration from Europe to America around 1900, the control that was exercised was by European states over the outflow, not so much by America over the inflow. Secondly, if you look at, for example, sub-state governments, provinces and municipalities, you can consider them as democratic polities because they have elections, they have voters who vote for governments at their level, and these governments have certain powers of self-government in their territories. But they operate under conditions where they have no control over the borders at all. That control has been monopolized by the state, and free movement inside the territory means there is democracy, you know, in the city of Florence, maybe in the province of Tuscany, without these entities having any form of immigration control into their territory. So obviously, apparently, it seems to be the case that democracy and self-government don't yield the conclusion that immigration control is a necessary feature of democracy. So what I want to do next is to come up with an alternative justification for immigration control that has nothing to do, or less to do with democracy, and more with the international state system. So remember I said, let's not look just at the one state of immigration and that people want to enter from outside, but let's look at the relations between states. And if we do that, we find out that in the international state system, immigration control today is indeed assumed to be an essential feature of what it means to be a state. Why is that the case? Because the territory of the world is divided up between states, and states also claim members as citizens that they are responsible for. In order for that system to function, states have to respect each other's sovereignty over the territory, but also each other's responsibility for their members. And that entails that states have a duty to admit their own citizens, but a power to control the non-citizens' entry into their territory. So my brief claim is that the power of immigration control is an inherent feature of the modern form of the Westphalian state system, not of previous historic systems, and not a feature of democracy, but of the international state system. And if democratic states operate within that state system, they have and they need this kind of immigration control power. But if they are democracies, a second question arises. Are they justified in exercising this power? And towards whom are they justified in exercising that power? And that is a question that democracies have to answer differently from non-democratic regimes. They have to appeal to democratic reasons why they need to exercise this power. And basically my short answer will be, democracies are justified in exercising the immigration control power if this is necessary in order to preserve the conditions for their democratic self-government. Their democratic self-government may be jeopardized, for example, if internal security breaks down because of a sudden inflow of immigrants. It may be jeopardized if immigrants, recently arrived immigrants, form a majority of the society and therefore control the political institutions. Let's call it colonialism. You know, imagine that there is an invasion from the outside and the democratic institutions are suddenly controlled or dominated by those who have just arrived. Democracy may be jeopardized finally, especially if it's a form of welfare state democracy, if the social welfare systems breaks down because of completely open borders towards countries that don't have any welfare system that is similar to the destination countries. So all of these may be valid reasons that can be invoked for controlling immigration on democratic grounds. So that argument suggests so far that maybe, as with the other sources of change, democracies need to draw a threshold line. No control of immigration up to number X, control of immigration beyond that for number X plus 1, because it might then jeopardize democracy. This is an old argument that was made by Bruce Ackerman already in 1980. And again, I want to challenge that argument a little bit by saying it's not so easy, not so fast. Democracies may have reasons to admit immigrants already before that threshold X is reached, and to keep out other immigrants before the threshold X is reached. And that has something to do with the way that immigrants can connect to societies before arrival and the reasons that democracies have to admit them. And here I want to show you my second slide, which is hopefully easier to understand than what I've talked so far. It's a little metaphor. It's a Kafkaesque metaphor. So for those who have read Kafka's parable or novel The Castle, you know, it may look familiar. This is a ground floor plan of an Italian Baroque palace. And one feature of these palaces is that each room has many adjacent rooms. You know? Often one room has 4 adjacent rooms, and these rooms are all connected through doors. But since the walls of these palaces are very thick, the doors are generally double doors. And that's the feature I want to focus on. So imagine now that this is you, right? Live in one of these rooms. And imagine at the first stage that each of these rooms is a democracy. Right? So you live with many other people, and you run a democratic government of the room. And the government in the room is represented by a guy who is the guard, and the guard has the keys. Right? The guard has the keys to the 4 doors. Right? And since you authorize the guard, you elect the guard, what you do is very clearly, you tell the guard he's under your command to open any doors that you tell him to open. So you have the right to leave the room, and you tell the guard, you pick a door, you tell the guard, open this door, right? And the guard has to do it. He's under your instructions. Now, the guard opens the door, and what you face is the second door, the door to the adjacent room. And that door is controlled by the guard in the adjacent room. So it's not open, it's closed. It has to be opened by the other guard. Now, what you can do is you knock on the door and you tell the guard, I want to enter your room. And the guard says, well, why do you want to enter my room? And you could answer, well, because I have a right to leave my room. But that won't hold water, because the guard can easily say, well, there are 3 other doors that you could have chosen. Why did you choose mine? You know, you won't be you have the right to leave if I keep my door closed. So the right of immigration is not strong enough to ground the right to immigration. You need to come up with a more specific reason. Now, think about what reasons you could come up with. One reason is you could say, look, I've elected that guard, you know, but it turns out that he is really a crazy guy, and he has a knife, and he started to go after people who disagree with him, and he has threatened to kill me. So if you don't open that door, he will certainly kill me. I don't have time to try the other doors. That's a very, very strong reason for the guard to open the door immediately, and then check after he has admitted you whether your claim is true or not. That is what is called asylum. Right? That's one reason. The second possible reason is that you tell the guard, well, don't you remember, last year you admitted my spouse, and she is now living in your room. So I have a right to live together with my spouse. Let me in. And again, that's a very strong reason, except that the guard might say, well, I can let your spouse enter your room. So you may have to come up with additional reasons why you want to have your family in the other room. A third reason is that you could say, look, on social media, I've seen pictures of your room, and it really looks in a very bad shape. I'm an interior decorator. You know, I can redo your room. It will be very good for you, and it will be good for me, because I will earn some money. And our room is already done. They don't need me as an interior decorator. So it would be what is called a triple benefit, you know, for all rooms and me, if you let me in. That's, again, a very good reason for the guard to open the door, but it's probably not a reason that gives you a right to enter the other room. Finally, you could also say, I want to, well, I've seen that in your room there's a famous painting that I always wanted to study, and so let me in, I want to see this painting. And here the guard might say, well, okay, fair enough, I'll let you in, but I'll charge you a ticket fee. And after you've seen the painting, you have to go back to your room. This is what's called tourism, right? So there are lots of reasons that states have to let in people into their territory. And these reasons are very distinct. They are not all of the same kind. You know, the model of the unconnected outsider who claims access to a territory is not good enough to sort out these reasons. And some of these reasons resonate very strongly with the claims to be a democracy, right? the reason to allow family reunification, the reason to protect people whose democratic government has broken down and who seek asylum. But also the reason to let in labor migrants if there's a triple benefit. I think resonate with democracy. Why? Because it appeals to the collective interests of the people in the room receiving the guy. It's for the benefit of the citizens that there should be an immigration policy that meets the triple benefit criterion for the individual, for the country of origin and country of destination. So these are the kinds of reasons that I think we can invoke in order to argue that democracies have good reasons and sometimes also normative commitments to keep their borders fairly open, not in the same way for everybody, but for distinct types of immigrants in different ways. Now I'll conclude with a final reflection. This is the third part of my paper here, which throws a wrench into the argument that I've just made a little bit. So if you have followed my argument so far, you could say that, okay, here are democratic norms. You might say first, there are liberal norms why states have to regulate their immigration in certain ways, and these liberal norms, how liberals think about liberal norms is very often either that they are self-reinforcing, so free markets are often considered by liberals to be self-reinforcing, or they have to be constitutionally entrenched against democracy. So constitutional courts and international law is there to rein in democracy. This is how liberals very often think about the relation between liberal norms and democracy. Now, I've invoked democratic norms rather than just liberal norms. And the problem with democratic norms is they are not self-reinforcing in the same way. And they cannot be deeply entrenched against democratic majorities. Democratic norms need democratic support. So citizens must be convinced of these reasons in order to accept fairly open borders. And that throws the whole thing, the argument, back into the political arena of democratic politics, where democratic majorities must be won through elections, public discourse, etc., etc. Now here the problem is that in this arena, there are always at least two views, right? And there is a view that says democratic self-determination is about immigration control, and what we need now is national closure in order to preserve the nation. And this is the national populist argument that we hear all around Europe, and not just in Europe, right? And against this view, you have to defend the view that, no, democracy requires that we keep our borders fairly open for all of these reasons. So the fight is out there, and it's not possible to predict what the outcome is, let alone to say that normative theory tells you what it will be. Now, what are the chances that the democratic argument will win over the anti-immigration argument? And here I think you need to conduct a thought experiment. The argument would be, let me put it like this first. Democrats may say, we accept your argument, but the decision over whether or not to have a closed society or a fairly open society is itself a democratic one. Who else could decide it? It can't be constitutional courts, it can't be international law, it's not the free market that decided. It must be decided by the electorate. So therefore, democratic self-determination kicks in at the ultimate question, how to decide whether to buy into your model versus the model of national closure that the populists are advocating. Now, to me, that looks a little bit like the famous dilemma that democracies could actually abolish themselves through democratic votes. If you had a stark decision between, a referendum, will we have a democratic constitution or an authoritarian one, you could say there is a way how you could democratically decide to have a non-democratic regime. I'm not saying that the choice that we face now is exactly of the same kind, but I'm claiming that the choice we may be facing is a choice between democratic openness on the one hand and democratic backsliding on the other hand. So the observation is based on the idea that nationalist populism today combines two features. which is the obsession about immigration control and the idea to capture democratic institutions in order to bring about democratic backsliding, to attack the constitutional and liberal features of democracy. And where we already see today, where nationalist populists have come to power and have been in power for some time, like in Hungary, we see both of these features being played out. A close conception of the nation against the immigrants out there, and a dismantling of democratic institutions and the rule of law inside. And so some people might say, well, that's not necessarily the case. Let's run a historically thought experiment. Do the two things always go together? And the one thing that I come up in the paper is the US in the period between 1924 and 1965. 1921-24 were the big immigration laws that introduced the quota system and basically closed immigration off for a long period in American history. And 1965 was the Hart-Celler Act that reopened America as a country of immigration. So the question is, well, people might say, look, America has remained a democracy during that period. What's your worry? Well, first there are two observations about this period. One is it brought us the New Deal. So the people who say that you need the closure to build a welfare state might have a point. It also brought us some of the worst racism and xenophobia that America has seen in its history. So the jury is a little bit open on what the outcome of the closure was. However, my main point is the conditions under which that closure happened and made it possible to preserve democracy no longer exist in Europe today. And that is built on the idea that European societies are today so deeply integrated and interdependent with each other that they have developed substantial sections of native populations that are themselves very strongly mobile and interested in preserving mobility and openness of these societies to a degree that American native citizens in the 1920s and 30s were not. In America, you really had an opposition between the sedentary citizens and the immigrants wanting to come in. In Europe, you no longer have that opposition. You have the opposition between a camp in society that wants more open and integrated European societies and a camp in society that wants more closed European democracies against integration and against immigrants. And if this is the setup, it means that if one of these sides wins, it will adopt a different version of democracy. So we have the choice between open democracy and a closed backsliding of democracy. And if that's the choice, it looks a little bit like the choice between democracy and non-democracy in the long run. So you might say that yes, it's true that there is self-determination over the future of democracy in the sense that it's ultimately decided by the citizens themselves, but it ought not to be determined by citizens in a way that leads to undermining democracy itself. And therefore, the two things of fairly open borders and stable and open democracy go together, and we ought to fight for it, but we don't know what the outcome will be. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Rainer. So we can now open the floor for questions and comments. I'll take 3 questions at a time. So who would like to start? Sorry? Okay. We'll start with you.
Thanks. Thank you very much for the presentation. I found it quite stimulating, sort of reconceptualization of the terms of the debate. I wanted to ask, or like maybe try to challenge one of your sort of intermediary principles. So you say that exercising the power of immigration control is only permissible for states if it is necessary for preserving their self-governance, if I understood correctly. And that seems to me a fairly liberal position, even in the debate on unilateral state control of immigration. But I still wonder if it can do enough work to justify that kind of immigration control, because unilateral statist immigration control is coercive, arguably, and it involves the threat of violence, and often it involves the practice of violence. And usually how we justify this, normatively, is with the police within democratic states, right? We say this is coercive, but the people who are subject to this coercion are sort of self-governing, and they are enfranchised, and they have legal recourse and all these things. But this doesn't seem to apply to me, to migrants, to people who apply, at border regimes. There is stuff in international law, people can appeal, I think. But the costs for this are very high, and the system is very flawed. So this seems to me to not be enough to justify this sort of coercion, unless you want to argue that sort of this preservation of self-governance regarding, the protection of welfare states, etc. If this sort of amounts to a last resort, like a self-defense argument, the closure of borders as a last resort to guarantee the survival of sort of a polity. But that seems to me, intuitively, seems to me to be a little bit too strong of a claim. So I wonder how you can respond to that.
Yeah, sure.
Adrian?
Yeah, thanks very much for a very interesting talk indeed. I have a question, of course, which you raised yourself. Where exactly, how is X plus Y defined, right?
How is what?
X plus Y, when you should say no more, not more than that. And you said it has to be in a democratic decision, right? And then you argued in the case of defining we have to limit immigration, you would get no democratic you would get automatically democratic backsliding. And my question is, how exactly does that institutionally work out? That you would say, now this is democratic backsliding, as opposed to when the popular vote or the democratic decision would say, no, we keep the borders open. There is no democratic backsliding institutionally.
Friedrich?
Yes, also thanks for me for a very thought-provoking talk. I'm not an expert in this, but I want to make two quick observations. One is about time and consistency of democratic decisions, and that makes it difficult to perhaps make immigration policy subjective to democratic decisions, because at one point, we want more migrant workers, and then they're there, and then public opinion switches, and now it's too many, and they should leave and stuff, and you cannot sort of build a coherent, time-consistent migration policy like that, perhaps. The other point is there has been a lot of metaphoric examples also about the relationship between states and the host state towards the individual migrant. What about thinking also along, two states and their relation between each other, the bilateral, interaction? That might be helpful to understand some things. It's just a suggestion. To think of migration like a treaty, like a trade treaty, there has to be benefits for both sides. And perhaps one source of populist arguments about migration is that it's not always clear, say, for a European destination country, what's their benefit about having migration, irregular migration from West Africa, where the benefit for the West African states might be very clear.
So do you want to respond to
Yeah.
It's a good start.
Okay, thanks. Really great questions. Thanks for those. So the first one is a really hard one. There's a famous quote by Joe Cairns that says, borders have guards and the guards have guns. So there is violence and coercion exercised at the borders. How can that be justified? There are justifications for using violence against criminals. But how can the same instruments be used against people who peacefully attempt to join a society and contribute to its wealth through working or whatever? And this is not easy. So one answer to this has been proposed by Arash Abizadeh, who says, well, since coercion is exercised at the border, and since democracies are committed to including all those in the making of their laws who are coerced by the laws, democracies have to include would-be immigrants in the making of their immigration laws. That means they have the demos cannot be bounded. You need, in a way, a global demos that includes everybody out there who might potentially immigrate to your country, and then let that demos decide on the immigration law of each country to make that coercion legitimate. He does not say that coercion is never justified. He says it needs to be justified through democratic participation of those who are coerced. That seems to me like a reductio ad absurdum. You know, it seems to me like leading into a paradox that is very hard to resolve. This is one reason why I don't buy into the principle that the demos ought to consist of all those who are potentially coerced by its laws. I think that leads to a claim for protection under the law, but not necessarily to a claim to participate in the making of the laws. That's another story that I've spelled out in a book and won't do here. But I think it just shows that we have to think harder about principles of democratic inclusion with regard to different purposes of inclusion. Inclusion in the sense of protection under the law, or inclusion in the sense of being entitled to authorize the government that makes the law. And to my sense, it doesn't make sense for democracies to authorize the rest of the world in the making of their laws, because otherwise they couldn't be self-governing in their territory. So we have to bite the bullet in that sense. It doesn't address fully the question, how can you justify the exercise of violence? And it's a hard one, and I think the only answer that you can have towards that is you can reduce the amount of violence if you have a fairly open and fair immigration system. So if you have a fair economic or labor migration system where people can actually apply and have a decent chance if they meet the criteria to be admitted, if the same people then choose an irregular route of entry, then I think it is in principle justified to say, well, you didn't use the channel that we offer you, therefore we use coercion in the sense that we deport you back to the country where you can apply for regular migration. So that's an implication. If you have different immigration channels, then they have to be policed in the sense that the people who don't use the opportunities offered to them can be legitimately rejected or also deported. That's something you have to accept. Let me come to Adrienne's questions. First, how to define the threshold X. Remember, I initially laid out the argument for the threshold X and then rejected it and saying maybe it's the wrong track if you think about the threshold, because one of the reasons is it's so hard to define. Bruce Ackerman, who initially made this argument, hinted at this himself. If you say that we need to define the threshold X at the point where security breaks down, that makes it very easy for xenophobic populists to say, well, we'll make sure that security breaks down even at the minimal amount of immigration. We'll just create trouble, and that will then serve as an excuse for lowering the threshold to the lowest possible level. So the threshold is not objectively given. It depends partly on the reaction to immigration inside the country. And therefore, it's much better not to think about one threshold, one yearly immigration quota, for example, where everybody can apply around the world, but to think about separate immigration channels. One channel for labor immigration that needs a kind of annual quota, but another channel for asylum migration that should not be counted in the same quota. David Miller and others make the mistake to say that every country should determine, as an exercise of self-determination, its own time inconsistency in democratic decisions on migration. Again, that's a tricky one I haven't thought about deeply, but the answer is probably there are some aspects of immigration policy that ought to be made time consistent by also entrenching them more deeply, giving them quasi-constitutional status. So, for example, refugee and asylum policy, I think it's extremely dangerous if you open that whole field up to constant policy change. With regard to labor migration, it's much more difficult to make that argument because it assumes that there is a triple benefit, so the definition of the benefit must be part of the public deliberation and can change over time. But here, my argument here was only that we should try to make citizens aware that it's in their own benefit, especially in aging European societies, to keep immigration policies fairly open for labor migrants, right? And you may fail to win that argument, and then there is a cycle where maybe it goes down as a result. And that's regrettable, but it's unavoidable within the rules of the democratic game. So we have to live with the problem of potential time inconsistency in many ways without being able to deal with it. Now, the second remark I want to pick up especially, which is your hint that we should think about bilateral interactions between states and what they do to migration. And that's actually a part that I completely skipped when I explained my metaphor, also for the sake of time. So let me briefly take up again the metaphor here and now come up with a slightly different scenario. What I've assumed here is that each of these rooms are separate states that have their own democratic governments. Now assume an alternative scenario, which maybe is more plausible, to say that the palace has a palace government or a management of the whole palace. It's not separate states, but it's the whole government, the whole palace that has this government, and it's democratic. So all the people living in the separate rooms of the palace elect a palace management. What would they do with regard to migration rights? The answer is very easy. They would instruct all the guards in all the rooms to keep all the doors open all the time. Because it's in their interest. They elect a government that ought to promote their opportunities, including the opportunities of mobility. So you would have freedom of movement between all of these rooms if you had a single layer of government. We don't have a world state. This is why that model is very hard to imagine in the system of independent and sovereign states. But there may be a third model that is perfectly feasible and actually does exist, which is that the citizens of your room could team up with the citizens of adjacent rooms and say, well, we have immigration control powers and duties to admit immigrants who come up with the right reasons. But you have the same immigration control powers and our rooms are quite similar, so why don't we instruct our guards on either side to keep both doors open between our rooms so that we can freely move between these rooms? And this is what the EU is about. You can have arrangement between states that guarantee freedom of movement between a certain number of these rooms while maintaining the power to control immigration from third rooms, right? That's a real world situation, but it's not a non-ideal situation because given the international state system, this is probably the best you can do in order to enhance freedom of movement in the real world. And it's normatively attractive, but it's linked. It's not a human right that we are talking about. This is one of the mistakes in the debate about open borders, that they always think about freedom of movement as a human right. It's a membership right. It's premised on the fact that you are a citizen of that state and that grants the same rights to the citizens of another state. This is how it works in the European Union. And this is how it works in South America and even in the Western African Union. So there are examples that this is a real world pathway to more freedom of movement where the claims of immigrants no longer need to be checked, whether they fit the economic, the refugee, the family box, etc., but where they can really enhance their opportunities across international borders. And it's another ultimate refutation of the idea that democracy inherently requires immigration control in order to be, because otherwise it's no longer democracy. There are states that voluntarily abandon their right to control immigration from other states on the basis of reciprocity. It's perfectly feasible. I think it's very desirable. and it's one of the main messages I want you to carry home from that talk.
Great, thank you, Rainer. So I've got three more. We've got Robert, then Bridget, then me. I'll actually also got one on the from the live stream as well. So maybe 4 this time, if that's okay, Rainer.
Yes,
see how you
sure.
get on with that. We'll keep raising the levels.
Yeah.
Who did I say first? Robert, was it? Yeah. No, Bridget. Sorry. Yeah. I can't.
So it's a great presentation. I really liked it. But I'm going to use 2 of your own maneuvers against you here, which is to use normative realism and the idea of splitting hairs on a term. So I want to challenge you a little bit just on your first argument about democratic legitimacy. So your claim is essentially that democratic self-determination does not include a right to determine immigration controls, right? But here, I actually think what really matters is how you engage with the idea that the demos in modernity is defined by a claim to nationalism, right? So you use the question of, can a democratic society kill itself through its own voting? The other, I think, that's the end question. The first question is how democracy is very simple, let the people decide, but sometimes first you have to decide who the people are, right? And so you dispatch with Walzer and the instrumentalist claims and the self-maintaining claims quite quickly, right? By saying essentially the nationalist argument that you have to maintain immigration is instrumental and therefore not sustainable. And then the second argument is that democratic societies change through technology or through birth rates or through cultural appropriations. And we allow that to happen, so why would we not allow immigration to also change as societies? But immigration is of a different order, right? Because it essentially challenges the definition of the people as exercising that democratic will. And so I think reflecting on that took your work, right? On the claim here of nationalism as generating legitimacy for democracy creates a whole other separate series of debates about immigration. And you can't dispatch with it just talking about Walzer and self-interest or about the other claims of change. You need to engage, I think, more deeply, and I'm sure you have, writing a paper, and only made it about 10% through, but engaging with that liberal nationalist argument about these fundamental claims of defining the legitimacy of that organization itself, right, to control its destiny.
So my reflection relates to the EU, because it is the part of the world where the international state system, the role of borders and territory has been transformed. I think it's unlike anywhere else in the world as an experiment in doing that, particularly in relation to the mobility of people. But in order to arrive at a high level of mobility, and I don't know whether you would say European societies are now fairly or relatively open to each other in terms of mobility, it required an enormous regulatory framework. Regulation on all sorts of things, labour markets, access to welfare, access to health systems. It also required a lot of reciprocal information sharing between the governments and a lot of horizontal institution building. That's not Brussels, but it's across the labour institutions of the member states. So it's a really complex institutional ecology. Is that required if we're going to use the EU model writ large for immigration, the so-called managed immigration debate? And then, even with all of the safeguards in the EU in terms of reciprocity, we now have one country that is exiting the EU and opting for a much more closed society. And there's no doubt in my mind that it was free movement, EU free movement, was mobilized as one of the dominant issues in a campaign. So in the real world of politics, with all of this institutional infrastructure in the EU, and the clear evidence that the British economy or the UK economy benefited enormously from the free movement, the 4.5 million EU nationals. In the end, it was mobilized as a negative and was a winning formula to arrive at a more closed end. So, in other words, what I'm asking is, what can we learn from the EU, both in terms of all of the protections that it has created, but also the fact, despite all that, a democratic polity has opted for exit?
I wanted to ask about realist political theory, which obviously the paper, you refer to it as a way of addressing citizens, and in particular in the section of the paper where you talk about openness and closure. I think fairly, you refer to populists and anti-immigration forces. And yet a lot of the work we've been doing on attitudes to migration, so the kind of people in the rooms in your parable, would suggest that there are populist anti-immigration attitudes. There are also people who hold values which are perhaps more conservative, or small c, or traditional. And I was in your paper, you talk about political theorists addressing citizens about migration and mobility and diversity. And I was wondering the extent to which realist political theory as a project would be capable, or how it might address people with these kind of conservative and traditional value orientations who are not opposed to immigration necessarily, and so don't fall into the kind of populist anti-immigration categories that you use in the closure section. So, and perhaps confounds a kind of a dichotomous relationship to openness and closure that you develop in that section of the paper, whereas in other parts of the paper it maybe is more nuanced around relative openness and relative closure. The final section, I think, maybe could consider attitudes perhaps as they really are, rather than the dichotomous representation of those attitudes. And we also have a question on the live stream. It's obviously it comes on WhatsApp, so it's quite short, so I'll read it to you. Yeah, now I've seen, oh yes. It's from Voltron Lekan, so thanks very much for sending the question in. But he asks, where does the principle of non-refoulement come into play in light of these democratic arguments? So the principle of non-refoulement in the light of the arguments that you make. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So Robert, is that, yeah. Okay. So just to rephrase the question as I understood it, immigration is a source of change that changes the composition of the people and of the demos, unlike maybe technology does or cultural change that comes in through the flow of ideas does. So there's something special about immigration that might justify why states need to control immigration more than they do the other sources of big change. Well, the first answer to this is, what about fertility? There is a nice quote by Hannah Arendt that I have used quite often that says, societies are constantly invaded by strangers, the newborn babies, right? We don't know what the next generation will do. Democratic politics is exposed to contingency of generational change, right? Probably in a much more profound way than it is exposed to migration, as long as migration is at the level where it currently is. And still, we don't have China's one-child policy, and the populists may have pro-fertility policies that we consider problematic from a liberal democratic perspective. So we accept that democracies are exposed to that type of change. Now, that's the kind of cheap answer to your question. The other one is, we still need to come up with a positive principle that says, how should democracies define who belongs to the people or the demos? And again, I can only say that I've written a book about this that I won't try to sum up. But my idea as an alternative of the two standard principles defended by theorists, which is the principle everybody should be included who is coerced by the laws, or everybody should be included who is affected by policy decisions, right? I think both of these principles lead to paradoxes that you cannot justify the drawing of any boundaries. In the case of coercion, for the reason that Arish Abisadi has spelled out, right? So I suggest a third alternative principle that I call the principle of citizenship stakeholding. Those and only those have a claim to be included in the demos who, because of the circumstances of their lives, have an interest in membership in the demos itself. That's not the same thing as being coerced by the law or by one law, or having an interest in a decision on one particular issue. And it means that, for example, the immigrants who join a society on a long-term basis do have a stake in being recognized as members of that society. Therefore, naturalization should be an entitlement that these immigrants have. It also means, potentially and more controversially, that people who have been born and raised in a society and then leave that society as immigrants still retain a significant stake in the future of that society that gives them a claim to still not just return to the society, but maybe also participate through their votes in the ongoing shaping of the future of that society. But it comes with limits. It means that people of Italian descent born in Argentina or Uruguay in the fourth generation, no longer have a stake in the country of origin of their ancestors that justifies why they have access to its citizenship. So it's a boundary principle that I think yields some kind of justify boundaries that reflect the reality of immigration without being completely indeterminate as the other principles are. Bridget's question about the EU, I think the EU is not the only example of freedom of movement, and it's maybe also a very demanding example of to emulate by the others. Because as you say, in the EU, freedom of movement was a core issue, but maybe not the only driving goal. The driving goals originally were permanent peace between these countries, and then eventually also a high level of economic integration. And these goals required deep horizontal and vertical integration, and making it ever more complex, and also building up this huge acquis that is so hard to opt out without a huge transformation of the country that opts out. And this is what we see now in the case of Brexit happening. In a way, the Brexit example, I think, makes it even more clear that in the EU context, if you open for a national closure with all the implications that include leaving the EU, you expose yourself to huge risks, not just in terms of the foregoing the economic benefits of integration, but also risks of democratic backsliding. We've seen it in the Boris Johnson campaign. Prorogation of parliament is one thing. Let's see what happens next. There may be a transition in Britain happening towards what Nadia Urbinati calls populist democracy, where democratic representation relies on the representation of audiences by a leader rather than on the ordinary democratic process as we know it. And that's extremely dangerous. For me, that's a form of democratic backsliding, and it has to do with opting out of the openness that the European rules imposed, in a way, on the member states. But that does not mean that states that want to have more openness need to adopt the EU model. So the people who want to make an agreement with adjacent rooms could say that, no, we don't want to have supranational integration of the European kind. We just want to have freedom of movement between our two states. And I don't see why that shouldn't be possible. So look at the Australian-New Zealand Trans-Tasman Sea Agreement, or the older Irish British free travel zone, or the Scandinavian Nordic Passport Union, right? These were projects that were driven by the goal of freedom of movement, but didn't have the grand ambition to create a supranational structure of governance. And I think that's perfectly feasible. So just to throw out the provocation, I don't see why we couldn't have an agreement with New Zealand on freedom of movement. What's the obstacle there? Are the welfare systems so incompatible? Rule of law. Look at the Copenhagen criterion and ask yourself, would New Zealand meet the Copenhagen criteria? And if it meets and they don't want to join, we could still have freedom of movement with New Zealand. So it may be much less demanding than opting into something like the EU is. Finally, Andrew. No, not finally. There is also the WhatsApp question. Maybe I take the WhatsApp question first. Non-refoulement. I think non-refoulement is, for good reasons, the cornerstone of international refugee law. And that's appropriately considered to be an issue of human rights rather than of membership-based rights that would necessarily rely on democracy. It's an obligation that also non-democratic states have under international law if they signed up to the Geneva Convention. So prima facie, it seems it's one of those rules that democracies impose on themselves to constrain the way how they act towards certain people who are stranded at their borders or inside their territory. It means not sending people back to where their life and liberties are endangered, independently of the reasons they had to come and enter the territory. So it applies also to those who can't claim Geneva Convention refugee status. Still, I think there is something in non-refoulement that resonates with democracies in particular ways. And that is with democracies in the international state system. As I said before, you know, in the international state system, states are responsible for protecting the rights of their own citizens. And this is why they have a duty to readmit their own citizens and a right or power to keep out or check the admission claims of those who are not their citizens. Now, that duty in a way breaks down, the logic of that duty breaks down where states are faced with people whose rights cannot be or will not be protected by their nationality of origin. So this is the case of non-refoulement. You can't send back people who are in danger. If you become then responsible, since you are now responsible for protecting their rights, their state of origin won't protect them against that danger. Therefore, this country is now responsible. So it's kind of substitute citizenship or temporary citizenship responsibility that states acquire towards people stranded in their territory who can claim non-refoulement. Therefore, I think democracies have an additional responsibility that they ought to acknowledge under the idea that claims to non-refoulement and asylum are surrogates for those who have lost their citizenship that is meant to provide them with that kind of protection. So finally, Andrew's argument about normative realism and popular attitudes. Yeah, I wish I knew more about popular attitudes. I do engage with empirical work on studying public policies and laws quite a lot. This is what we do at the Global Citizenship Observatory, but we don't really look into public attitudes. So we're very happy to have this division of labor and this big resource next door in Malafrasca, where you collect all this data. And I acknowledge that public attitudes on migration can be much more complex than people often assume. So there is a general assumption that wherever you look, there will be majorities to have less immigration than immigration that is already happening. So that's a standard assumption in the comparative literature. Liberalism pushes doors open for immigration that democratic majorities would never support. So it's liberalism against democracy that drives the open borders. And if you look closer at public attitudes, and if you ask the right kind of questions, and if you do not just standard surveys, but also deliberative polls, then sometimes you find that citizens understand the democratic reasons for open borders quite well. So it supports my claim that you can actually use these arguments to address broader audiences. However, among public attitudes, you have many different attitudes, right? And as you say, you have maybe conservative, traditional attitudes that feel somehow left behind in all that talk about open society and dynamic change through immigration and its benefits, because they see their ways of life being rapidly transformed out of their control. And now, the first thing we have to say that their agenda is not really protected and taken care of by the populists who claim to represent them. Very often there is a big, populism is an alternative project of modernizing societies. It's not a project of winding back the clock to a conservative past that is irretrievable. So that's one thing we have to say. The radical populists are not cultural conservatives. They pretend to be, right? For example, they use Christianity, now very popular. Viktor Orban, he presumes that he has a European mission because he defends the Christian roots of Europe against the countries that admit Muslims. There is very little of Christian doctrine in that policy. It's actually using Christianity as a marker to identify who doesn't belong and who doesn't have a claim.
Like Salvini.
Yeah, and same with Salvini and whoever you might quote on this. So you have to engage in that battle, in debunking and deconstructing the populist arguments as not even respecting the values that they pretend to defend, which are very often cultural conservative values. It still doesn't answer the question what to do with the cultural conservative values. And I think one of the answers must be, and I have this in a line in the paper, that if you think, for example, about the economic benefits of regulated labor migration programs, right? Then economists think about these benefits at the level of GDP, right? Mm. And maybe that's the wrong attitude. You have to also say that if you have economic benefits that will be very unevenly distributed inside the country, then an economic immigration program needs to be coupled with an internal redistributive program that will compensate the losers of an open immigration policy and will make it plausible to them that they will maybe not benefit in their life. Their traditional ways of life will change, but they will be compensated in a way that they don't see themselves as being entirely left behind, which feeds the populist rebellion. So more research into public attitudes is very necessary.
Yep, we'll do it. Thank you. And maybe and hopefully cooperate with you and Global Sit as well on that. That would be great. So we have Carlos, and we have another question on that's come from the live stream.
Can I have some still water, please?
Does anybody else like to join this round? Okay. Carlos, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Rainer, for the presentation. Very exciting as always. And I have a couple of questions for clarification. The first one, I would like to hear some more elaboration on the theoretical connection between closure and backsliding. Because you went through specific examples, and the Hungarian case is very prominent, but there are the cases in which this connection is not so clear. Take the case of Poland, a backsliding state that claims nevertheless have taken a number of steps to integrate Ukrainian migrants. So they take a more differentiated approach. And in that respect, I refer to what Andrew said. Perhaps we need to nuance a little bit, not to make this kind of very string categories between closure and openness, but different degrees of closure and openness. But still I'm missing what is the theoretical connection between closure and backsliding, rather than merely pinpointing there are some cases in which this connection practically exists. Is there a theoretical connection there? The second thing is about institutional implications for your thesis. If decisions about migration are removed from the democratic process, that implies to constitutionalize them. Constitutionalize them. In practical terms, it's unfeasible if one state makes in isolation. That would create a kind of absolutely dissolution of the immigration community. Right? That means that it has to be concerted action, an action adopted by a number of states. In a extreme case, it seems to me they are advocating for some kind of global right, or universal right to migration, because it would be very difficult to hold that in isolation. A group of states cannot really hold that isolation. You will come to the very practical argument that the Union is going to refer to that, but I think that constitutionalization in isolation is not practically feasible. Right? Then, in particular, you are claiming for some kind of universal right. Now, the European case as a pragmatic alternative presents to me a theoretical challenge, which is the following. The theoretical union, in a extreme case, let's assume that the European Union is able to regulate migration at the European Union level. And by doing that, what it does is to remove from the democratic process the regulation of migration. So it constitutionalizes that in a certain level. But the paradox is that it doesn't do that in relation to the external world, but rather to the internal demos. So you have this paradox in which you have to remove migration from the decision of the internal demos. You have constitutionalized that at the European Union level, and yet you have the same problems about closure that you are discussing here, because the European Union can decide to be very close versus the external world. So how do you resolve this paradox? Your case, your pragmatic case, nevertheless doesn't resolve the theoretical question that you are putting on the table.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rainer. So I totally buy your argument that about immigration control is not constitutive or necessary for the upholding of democracy or the demos. But the thing I don't understand, and I wanted to have more clarification, is the second principle where you say that democratic norms provides admission claims. Because for me it's the liberal side, this liberal norms and constitutionalism who provides these claims, so not the democracy. So for me the argument is less about the democratic problem, is really this, and I think maybe here again we agree, it's the issue that those who are for closed nation states might turn against democracy. So the consequences of those who are for closed nation states, because like So the nice argument by Jan Werner Müller that the populists actually they are against the majoritarian principle because they are defend dead people, which is the people not as counting numbers but as feeling numbers. So I think there is more the problem, but I wanted to hear more about how do you think that democratic norms as such, because for me it's the liberal norms from which admission claims result. And the tiny argument about following up what Robert said, that immigration is another rank in the terms of like these other changes, in the terms, because the fertility argument, I mean, it sounds compelling, but on the other hand, couldn't you say that the fertility or children are a voluntary decision by the demos and as such have to be accepted? You know, whereas migration maybe is up to the decision of the demos. So still maybe fertility is not the same as...
It's parents deciding, right? It's not the demos deciding.
Yes, but
fertility.
Exactly, but the parents is part of the demos who are already citizens in this sense.
We've got one question as well that's come in from the live stream. It's from Simone Hanrath. And thanks. So it's obviously difficult to condense a question to a bit of text. So I'll read it out, and thanks to Simone for sending it. So the question is, if the argument runs that states have come to acquire a legitimate claim on citizens and members as well as territory, where does that place Giorgio Agamben's argument about bare life?
Whose argument? Oh, Agamben's. Okay.
Agamben's argument about bare life. That's from Simone. Thank you.
That's it, right? Okay, Carlos.
Just those three.
First, on different degrees of openness among populist regimes. Yes, it's true. Poland is surprisingly one of the states with the highest immigration numbers currently, and it's mostly Ukrainian temporary migrants, basically. So the conditions under which Poland does that is, first, they are considered to be culturally not too distant, but more importantly, they are considered to be strictly temporary. So there is no pathway to Polish citizenship built into that migration program. It's a kind of openness, you know, if you want to use an extreme example, that is a little bit like the openness of the Gulf states, which are the world record holders in terms of shares of immigrants among the population. The condition for that openness is we never, ever would consider them to become citizens of the Gulf states. And we let them in order to maintain a system of citizenship privileges for the natives so that they don't have to do the dirty works of the migrants. I'm not saying that this is the case in Poland. You might actually make a positive claim for the beneficial effects of Ukrainian immigration in many ways. So it might satisfy the triple win criteria quite well. It might be, actually, I don't know enough about it, might be a model economic immigration program, except for the closure of access to citizenship that you find because of the disconnect with the Polish citizenship law. So you can have a model of national closure that refers basically to who belongs to the people, combined with relative openness for a certain type of immigration under the condition that there is complete control over that and that it's only temporary. So that's not incompatible. I could imagine, you know, at some point Hungary with the declining demography, it's quite dramatically declining, so also having these kinds of programs and Orban declaring these are Christian immigrants and they're going to stay only for a short while. No contradiction there with the general story that the kind of openness that I've advocated cannot be reduced to the one channel of economic migration, and that channel cannot be closed off at the point of access to citizenship as it is in those cases. Now, your second point is, can we remove from the democratic process migration decisions? And here, my first answer is that's not what I've tried to argue. You know, in a way, I've argued that if we accept that the reasons for openness are not just liberal ones, but also democratic ones, and I'll come to that in a minute, then it follows that we expose those reasons to democratic decision-making, including through elections, right? And therefore we cannot fully constitutionalize them. Now I would immediately say that that applies differently to the different types of admission claims that I've said. So for example, I would advocate to strongly constitutionalize or entrench, decisions on asylum seekers and on family reunification. I would also say that, at least in the European Union, freedom of movement for the other member states needs to be constitutionalized in the sense that it's set aside, from what the democratic legislator in each member state can decide, apart if the democratic legislator is willing to bite the bullet and to opt out of the EU. That's the Brexit case, right? So it comes with a very heavy price to pay if you really are serious about controlling freedom of movement in the European Union. So what does it mean to accept the democratic exposure of migration decisions? It means you have to win the argument in electoral arenas, in public discourses. But my point is, you win the argument only if you don't constrain yourself to the liberal justice-based reasons. You win it only if you also appeal to democratic reasons that will resonate with people because they see it as linked to the common good of that particular polity. So let me mention one example. In the 1970s, my country, Austria, had absolute majorities for social democratic governments. That's a very distant past now in Europe. And our then Chancellor Bruno Kreisky, when confronted with a minor inflow of asylum seekers from communist countries in the 1970s, said, well, we'll handle that crisis by looking at Switzerland as a model. I want Austria to be as proud of its refugee policy as Switzerland is of the Red Cross. So the idea is it should become part of our national identity that we admit these asylum seekers. He didn't say that we admit them only as a transit country because we want them to go to America or to Israel or to other places. But the spirit of it was an attempt to convince an Austrian democratic audience that it's in their own interest, even not in their material interest in any way. It should be a matter of national pride, that they honor international commitments towards refugees. So this is in a way what I'm saying. I'm not dismissing the liberal arguments. I'm saying that the liberal arguments need to be backed up in the democratic arena by these kinds of arguments. Now that brings me, you had a third question, but no, let me address Lila's first because that links up very nicely. So what argument did I make how democratic norms support admission claims and not just liberal norms? I have to say that I replaced a section in my paper where I spell out the democratic norms more specifically with that metaphor of the palace because I felt it's easier to explain in an oral talk. But what I attempt in the paper is to say that look at the argument for regulated economic migration policy. So is that argument a liberal one? Yeah, to a certain extent, if you buy into the liberal consequentialist utilitarian argument, for these labor migration programs, the triple win. But the triple win actually has this component where it says it must also be beneficial for the country of destination, not just reduce global inequality and improve the situation of migrants. And that component is something that resonates with any discourse about the common good of the polity. It's the common good of the polity means the common good of all the citizens, and therefore you need these compensatory programs that will compensate the losers because of the program. But this is not an entirely liberal argument. This is a democratic argument too, because it says there's something that we as a collective can gain if we cooperate with other states in regulated labor migration programs. Now look at the claims of family reunification. It's a human rights, to private and family life. But how does the right work? The right is not only the human right of the incoming spouse or minor child to join a parent. That alone wouldn't do the job because it will leave open the question, why should they have family reunion in this country rather than in the country of origin? Why shouldn't the immigrant move back to the country of origin? If you want to answer that question, you need another argument, which is no longer a liberal argument, which is the argument about claims to membership, right? Of those who are already admitted, right? If they have a right to stay, then you cannot invoke, their family reunification right against that right to stay. And the right to stay is basically a right as new or potential members of a democratic society. It means you cannot have the temporary migration programs that tells them no family reunification even after 5 or 10 years. To my mind, is again an argument. We've admitted these people, and they're joining a democratic society, and therefore we have to consider them as members, and therefore family reunification has to be accepted in this country rather than sending them back. Similar arguments about asylum and refugees. I'm not counterposing the liberal human rights arguments with the democratic arguments. I'm saying there's a layer that has to be added on top of the liberal human rights arguments in order to make the claim for open immigration resonate with the democratic audience. There was a third question raised by Carlos about the EU. The paradox that the EU removes free movement from democratic decision-making in the member states, but leaves it largely with member states with regard to control of third country migration. Yes, that's in a way how it is. Also, even regulation of third country migration is increasingly, regulated through EU directives and norms, and member states are constrained, and are even interested in pooling their sovereignty in the aspect of control. External border control is an EU matter just as much as a member state matter, so it's no longer exclusive national sovereignty in that area either. It just means that once you accept free movement, and I think there's an inherent link between these two things. Once you accept free movement between states, there is a dynamic, as even the conservatives acknowledge, that it entails you also need to coordinate your rules on external immigration control, because whom you let into the territory of one state has access to the territory of all the other member states. So that logic is quite strong, but it can be used both ways. It can be used by saying, and therefore we go towards the lowest common denominator, and any member state can determine how close we all want to be. Or you can say, well, if we accept the democratic reasons for admission channels of third country nationals as part of the democratic ethos of the member states of the EU, then we may have to move upwards with regard to the level of openness that is coordinated through the immigration control that member states still exercise.
We had the third question as well, which came in from Simone, which was the question asking about
Agamben, yes.
And your in relation to this idea of bare life.
Yes. So again, let me acknowledge that there is a problem out there, just as the problem that you raised with regard to violence exercised at the border. States are not just nice, organizations pursuing the common good of all their citizens and residents. States have a monopoly of violence, and that monopoly of violence ultimately can destroy individuals. And so there is a dark side to modern statehood, and there is a dark side to seeing like a state when it comes to migration. And there are theorists like Agamben who have focused on that dark side entirely and said, and made that dark side the test, of the critique of liberalism, by saying that if you look at people in detention camps, they are reduced to bare life. And it's an argument that was previously made in different ways about Hannah Arendt in her book on the origins of totalitarianism, where she talked about refugees and stateless in the interwar period as being stripped of their membership in any state and therefore reduced in a way to a situation of bare life where no state would recognize responsibility to protect them. Right? This is true, it does exist. I just want to warn against generalizing this and saying this. All immigration is about that problem. just as it would be wrong to think that all citizenship policies is about the problem of statelessness. It does affect at the margin a substantial number of people, and wherever it affects anybody, the answer is not just democratic norms, but it's basic norms of human rights and decency that mean that states have to do something about this and help people out of that status, or not throw them into the cages of this bare life status in the first place. It's a crime where it happens, and states ought to have criminal liability for these kinds of situations. It just does not mean, I don't agree with the critical theorists who say this is pulling the mask off the face of the liberal state and revealing its true nature as being still an oppressive, racist, colonizing state that exposes people to this. Because it's not true for many people. It's not true for free movers in the EU. They face lots of problems, but they're not reduced to bare life. They're enjoying the freedom of movement that many people in the world aspire for. And we ought to acknowledge that too. There is a possibility of progress and achievement that beyond that issue that needs to be addressed, but I acknowledge that issue needs to be addressed as a human rights issue and as the core of human rights.
Thank you, Ryan. I think we've run out of time, and I think we've, in a small room, I feel like one of the smaller rooms in your parable of the palace here, so probably people need...
Open the doors.
Yeah, open the doors, and this is double doors. So hopefully you'll be allowed to exit through that door, enter another room. But before that, just one quick announcement. We have a seminar tomorrow afternoon here in this very room with Philip Connor from Pew Research in Washington, D.C., who's going to be talking about Pew Research's work on estimating unauthorized immigrant populations in the United States and Europe. So that's tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. And finally, I'd like to thank Rainer and also hope that we'll be able to continue working with Global Sit. I think there's exciting things going to happen in the near future with Global Sit, so there's great scope for us to continue cooperating with you, and many thanks for such a great talk today. Thank you.